They said it was just an old custom, a public formality. But listen closely and you'll hear the truth crawling beneath the laughter of the crowd. A woman, trembling, a rope tied around her neck like an animal's leash, stands on a wooden block in the middle of a 19th-century market square. Her husband, or rather her owner, announces her worth. The men gather, coins clinking, eyes gleaming. She doesn't look at them. She stares at the ground where blood from the butcher's stall runs between her bare feet. This isn't a sale. It's a ritual. A cleansing. A transfer of ownership under the illusion of freedom. And for the right price, a man could buy not just her body, but her silence, and everything that silence had seen. You weren't supposed to know this part of history. It was written out, buried beneath polite words like separation, arrangement, custom. But behind those words was a darker truth. The wife auction was never about ending a marriage. It was about proving control, about reminding every woman in the crowd that love was property and that property could be traded. England, 1832. The Industrial Revolution roaring like a god of iron. But here in the dirt and echo of a small town square, you see the real machinery, not of steel, but of obedience. When the hammer falls, the crowd cheers. The woman flinches. The man who buys her doesn't even look pleased. He looks victorious. He has taken another man's shame and turned it into his own possession. And the system smiles, because that's how it keeps men divided, by selling them symbols of control while quietly controlling them all. You see, the wife auction wasn't born from lust or desperation. It was engineered. It was a social experiment masquerading as tradition, a public act of humiliation to keep both genders in their place. And when something that cruel becomes normal, the world learns to kill A, B for its own captivity. So when you hear history speak of progress, ask yourself, progress for whom? Because what they called freedom was just another chain, polished and renamed. Now, tell me, if they could sell a woman's life in front of hundreds, what do you think they could sell from yours without you even noticing? They called it a marketplace, but it was really a theater, and every soul who stood there was part of the performance, the men with their coins, the women pretending not to watch, the preacher who said nothing, the lawman who looked away, and above them all, the silent scriptwriter of power, shaping a world where morality itself could be bought and sold. You see, the wife auction wasn't born out of chaos. It was sanctioned by order. Hidden within the cracks of law and scripture, it flourished not because people were ignorant, but because they were obedient. The church preached sanctity, but the crown preached taxes. And when the two needed to coexist, a compromise was born, an unholy agreement disguised as culture. A man could sell his wife if he claimed her unfaithful, unsuitable, or unwanted. And so the ritual began. The crowd gathered, and the silence of institutions became its own currency. But don't think this was about the poor alone. Even the wealthy came to watch, not to buy, but to believe, to reaffirm that the hierarchy was real, that they were safely above the dirt of the spectacle, that they could look upon humiliation and feel righteous. And in that illusion, power multiplied. Every sale was a sermon. Every cheer was a confession. The system didn't need soldiers to maintain control. It needed spectators, people who would laugh at pain as long as it wasn't their own. That was the true genius of the age, to make cruelty communal and call it tradition. They said these markets gave women freedom, a chance to escape unhappy marriages. But that's how darkness always hides, in the language of virtue. They were told they were being liberated, when in truth they were being rebranded, from wife to property, from person to transaction. And beneath the surface, something else was happening, something far more deliberate. The spectacle was not Saint social, but psychological. A lesson written in public shame. You belong to the system. You may rebel, but you will do it where we can see you, and we will make your rebellion part of our entertainment. This wasn't history's mistake. It was its design. The wooden block wasn't just a platform. It was an altar. The rope wasn't a leash. It was a symbol. And the crowd, though they laughed and bargained, were the congregation of an ancient rite disguised as entertainment. What happened in those markets wasn't merely commerce. It was ritual. It was the reenactment of a belief far older than the British Empire itself, that domination purifies and obedience sanctifies. When a woman was led to the market, she was not just being sold, she was being sacrificed to the order. Her humiliation reaffirmed the hierarchy: man above woman, class above poverty, crown above all. Each transaction renewed the invisible covenant that bound society together, a covenant written not in ink but in fear. You must understand, the system didn't need belief in God. It needed belief in authority, so it borrowed the language of religion, the posture of ritual, the silence of the sacred. A wife auction began with a public gathering, a symbolic offering, and the ringing of coins, like the ringing of bells in a church. Witnesses surrounded her, their gazes serving as collective confession. And when the hammer struck the wood, it echoed like the final word of a sermon. So it is done. Those in power knew exactly what they were doing. You can trace it through centuries of empire, how the institutions that ruled men learned to mimic religion while replacing its center. Where once people feared divine judgment, they now feared public shame. And so the ritual of ownership evolved, from temples to courts, from altars to markets, from sacrifice to sale. The real cruelty was not in the sale itself, but in the story that justified it. They told the people that this act kept order, that it prevented violence, that it gave everyone a place. But order built on humiliation is not peace, it is paralysis. It is the silence of people who've been taught that suffering is natural, that control is destiny, that freedom must always come at a price. The wife auction wasn't an event, it was a mirror. And when you looked into it, you didn't see a woman being sold. You saw civilization showing its true face. Every ritual has its architects, the unseen engineers who build the illusion, shape the stage, and whisper to the crowd when to cheer. The wife auction was no different. It didn't rise from the dirt of the market, it descended from the marble of the courthouse, from the pulpit, from the writing desks of men who called themselves reformers, yet feared one thing above all: autonomy. They understood something about human psychology that most still don't, that control doesn't begin with chains, it begins with permission. If you can convince a man that degradation is normal, that injustice is necessary, he will become his own jailer. He will enforce the system on others for free. That was the brilliance of the 19th century's moral engineers. They didn't need to suppress rebellion, they only needed to rewrite its purpose. The so-called reformers of the age, the magistrates and moralists, claimed these auctions were a working man's divorce, a pragmatic solution for the poor. But behind their compassion was calculation. The church kept its hands clean while quietly sanctioning the process, because it preserved hierarchy without legal confrontation. The crown turned away because it pacified the restless lower class, giving them an illusion of power while keeping real authority untouched. And the press? It turned it all into spectacle, transforming cruelty into curiosity. You see the pattern, don't you? When the people are given a small public outlet for power, even one drenched in cruelty, they stop asking about the larger chains that bind them. It's distraction disguised as freedom. It's the same blueprint that reappears across history, in public punishments, in televised scandals, in the constant drama of division. Keep them entertained, keep them outraged, keep them obedient through emotion. And so, the hidden architects built a world where power could humiliate the weak in daylight and call it justice. They didn't just train submission, they ritualized it. Every cheer, every laugh, every look of indifference was another brick in their invisible temple. These weren't mindless crowds, they were apprentices of control, learning the script they'd one day perform on each other. The architects didn't need to rule forever. They just needed to make the people believe that someone had to. Imagine the sound first, not the words, but the noise. The laughter that doesn't sound like laughter, the whispers that carry judgment, the shuffle of boots against dirt as the crowd forms a circle around her. The woman stands in the middle, rope around her neck, and somewhere in that swarm of faces is her child, watching. That's how the ritual begins, not with cruelty, but with spectatorship. The theater of shame depends on the eyes. The more who watch, the deeper the wound becomes. In those 19th century markets, humiliation was currency. The poor watched the poorer. The desperate mocked the damned, because when you could point to someone else's fall, you didn't have to feel your own. The crowd laughed not because they were cruel, but because they were afraid. And fear, when shared, becomes performance. That's the psychology the architects understood. Shame is contagious, and it controls faster than law. One public humiliation could silence a village. Every wife who saw it learned her limits. Every husband learned what power looked like when exercised in daylight. The message was clear. Obedience wasn't virtue, it was survival. You think we've outgrown it, but the theater remains. It just wears new costumes. Today, it's online, the modern marketplace of ridicule where reputations are sold and souls are auctioned to algorithms, but the energy is the same. The crowd still gathers, the crowd still feeds. The only difference is the stage. The wife auction was never only about one woman. It was about conditioning, teaching an entire society to participate in its own subjugation. Every cheer was a confession of fear disguised as power. Every laugh was an offering to the system that fed on both tormentor and victim. And when the auction ended, when the crowd dispersed, something invisible lingered in the air, a lesson that no sermon could erase. You are what I permit you to be. That's how empires survive, not by force, but by convincing you that your cage is a choice. And if you ever wonder how such cruelty became acceptable, ask yourself, when was the last time you watched someone's public destruction and felt relieved it wasn't you? Silence doesn't happen by accident. It's engineered. It's built layer by layer, like a cathedral with no doors. And in the 19th century, the architects of control built one of the most efficient machines of silence ever designed. It didn't need weapons. It didn't need soldiers. It only needed words, the kind written in scripture, law, and social expectation. When a woman was sold, the church said nothing. The law said less. Because both institutions were built on the same foundation, obedience disguised as virtue. A wife's voice, once given in marriage, was considered property, and property doesn't speak. The system didn't erase her words. It declared them irrelevant. This was the machinery of silence, the network of belief that made cruelty appear holy, the priest who preached submission as salvation, the magistrate who called humiliation justice, the writers who mocked the victims in satire to make the public laugh so no one would look too closely. And it worked. Because when shame is turned into entertainment, truth becomes unprofitable. But here's the deeper secret. Silence wasn't just for women. It was for everyone. The men who sold their wives weren't free either. They were trapped in a structure that measured worth by dominance, not by integrity. If a man failed to control his home, society branded him weak, and so the machine kept turning, feeding on fear from every direction. Every witness who stayed quiet added a cog. Every preacher who justified it added another gear. And generation after generation, the noise of the market grew louder, but the voices of conscience grew quieter, until the ritual itself became invisible. People stopped seeing it for what it was. They called it custom, then history, then myth. That's how silence wins, by changing names until truth sounds unfamiliar. The machinery didn't die. It evolved. Today, it operates through our institutions that still teach us which truths are safe to speak, which names to trust, which questions to never ask. Because silence isn't the absence of sound, it's the presence of control. And those who built that machine learned one lesson better than any other. If you make people fear speaking, you don't need to fear rebellion. Every empire, every hierarchy, every hidden system of control depends on one essential illusion: that obedience is noble, that submission is strength, that silence, when dressed in dignity, is something to be proud of. The wife auction was not just a public cruelty, it was a school, a training ground where men and women alike were taught the same deadly lesson: accept your place and call it virtue. They said a good woman obeys her husband, a good man obeys his station, a good subject obeys the crown. Each phrase seemed harmless, moral, even divine. But beneath the surface, obedience was currency, the most valuable commodity of the age. It kept factories running, armies marching, and the lower classes from asking why their suffering was celebrated as duty. The wife auction was only the surface of a deeper economy, an emotional economy where people were paid in pride to accept their chains. The poor man who sold his wife believed he was exercising power, but in truth, he was performing submission. He played his part in the theater of control, reaffirming that all power flowed downward, from God to king to man to woman, and the audience applauded, never realizing they were the ones being hypnotized. Obedience has always been the most efficient form of control because it feels like choice. You believe you are moral, disciplined, righteous, when in reality, you've been trained to equate compliance with identity. The architects didn't want rebellion. They wanted participation. They wanted the crowd to enforce its own subjugation. That's how it still works today. The faces have changed, the rituals evolved, but the structure remains. People are told to obey the system, the algorithm, the narrative, and they do it proudly. Because they've been conditioned to believe that questioning is dangerous, that defiance is disorder, that freedom must be earned through submission. But here's the question no one dares ask. What if obedience is the very thing that keeps you from becoming what you were meant to be? What if the virtue you were praised for was the very chain you were taught to polish? They taught you to fear disobedience, but never told you what obedience costs. When the wooden blocks were dismantled and the markets fell silent, it didn't end. The chains simply changed form. You see, the wife auction didn't just sell people, it sold memory. It passed down humiliation the way families pass down heirlooms. What was once public became private, whispered through generations, shaping the way people loved, feared, and obeyed. A daughter growing up in 1850 might never have seen a wife auction, but she would have felt its shadow. The way her mother avoided eye contact with men, the way her father's silence carried guilt, the way neighbors spoke about good women and fallen women like two sides of the same coin. These weren't opinions, they were residues, the psychological fingerprints of centuries of degradation. That's the cruel genius of social control. It doesn't need to repeat itself to remain effective, it just needs to be remembered. Shame, once planted, grows roots that live longer than empires. It hides in mannerisms, in posture, in how people apologize for existing. And soon, the system doesn't have to enforce humiliation. People enforce it on themselves. Every time a woman lowered her eyes out of fear of being called defiant, every time a man silenced his compassion to appear strong, the ritual was reenacted. The market square lived on, not in bricks and dirt, but in the unspoken. That's how control evolves, from external chains to internal conditioning. The inheritance of shame becomes a language. It teaches you who to trust, how to stand, what to fear. It tells you that love is earned through suffering, that dignity requires permission, that silence keeps you safe. And when those beliefs pass from parent to child, they stop feeling like lies. They start feeling like nature. But the truth is this: shame is not inherited. It's taught, and anything taught can be untaught. Yet few ever try, because confronting inherited humiliation feels like betraying one's own bloodline. The system knew this. It built loyalty out of trauma. It convinced generations to guard their own cages, to polish the locks and call it legacy. So when people say that's just how things were, remember, how things were is exactly how control wants them to remain. Every empire eventually breeds its opposite, a quiet rebellion hiding beneath its own laws. The wife auction may have appeared absolute, but even in the darkest markets, something ancient and defiant stirred. The rebellion didn't roar, it whispered. It moved not through armies or riots, but through symbols, secrets, and the smallest acts of refusal. It began with women who refused to break. Some, when led to the block, spoke prayers not to God, but to themselves, silent vows that no sale could erase who they were. Others escaped before their auction and were never seen again, vanishing into the anonymity of cities that swallowed the poor whole. But the most dangerous rebels weren't the ones who ran. They were the ones who stayed. They learned to bend without breaking, to wear obedience like armor while hiding knives made of words. In the taverns of Birmingham, in the alleyways of Bristol, in the servants' quarters of manor houses, they met in whispers. Women teaching women how to read, how to write, how to question. A stolen Bible reinterpreted as a manual for self-sovereignty. A coded message hidden in embroidery patterns, flowers stitched not for beauty, but for defiance. The system called them sinners. History called them nameless. But make no mistake, they were architects of awakening, and some men joined them, those who had seen the machinery for what it truly was, a parasite feeding on everyone. Poor men, stripped of dignity by the same system that made them feel powerful for a moment, began to see the lie. A few spoke out quietly in pubs and pamphlets, warning others, "We are not free, we are performing freedom." The rebellion spread like smoke, impossible to capture, impossible to extinguish. Because it wasn't a movement of politics, it was a movement of perception. Once you see the design, you cannot unsee it. And that's what frightened the high-techs most. Not violence, but awareness. Awareness is the one contagion that control cannot contain. You, watching this now, are part of that same lineage. The rebellion is older than you think, and it lives anywhere silence is refused. Comment below the phrase, "I see the design," not for the algorithm, but to mark that you've crossed the threshold. Say it twice, and the system will never own your mind again. The rebellion spread too quietly for the system to crush with force, so it chose the subtler weapon, redemption. When direct punishment no longer silenced defiance, they offered forgiveness. At a cost, the crown, the church, the law, all began to rebrand control as moral healing. They didn't need to chain the body anymore if they could convince the soul that obedience was salvation. This was the veil of redemption. It began with words, soft, benevolent, rehearsed. Priests preached that a woman's suffering purified her, that endurance was divine, that pain was proof of virtue. The same church that turned away from the auction block now built refuges for fallen women. But those refuges were prisons made of scripture, institutions where women were scrubbed clean of sin until they forgot what freedom felt like. Redemption became a business. Donations flowed. Newspapers praised it. The same society that once cheered at auctions now applauded at reform. But the machinery hadn't changed. It had simply been polished. The goal was no longer humiliation. It was transformation, molding people into ideal subjects through guilt, shame, and repentance. Every sermon, every confession, every moral tale served a single purpose: to make people grateful for their own restraint, to turn submission into self-love. The priests spoke of redemption, but what they really meant was reprogramming. You weren't forgiven for your rebellion. You were erased for it. That's how control evolved. It stopped fighting rebellion and started absorbing it. The rebels who sought freedom were told they were merely broken souls needing repair. Their fire was redefined as sickness, their questions were renamed as doubt, and so society learned to applaud its own spiritual captivity, a nation kneeling, thinking it was healed. But here's the hidden irony. Redemption was never about saving souls. It was about rebranding obedience. When the system realized people were awakening, it didn't strike back, it offered them a kinder cage. And many accepted it because the bars were lined with virtue and the guards spoke in the language of love. That's the danger of moral control. It feels good to be trapped when you're told it's holy. Remember this, the most effective prison is not built with walls, but with gratitude. When the world began to call itself modern, the old chains became embarrassing. Public cruelty no longer fit the new image of progress, so it had to be redesigned. They didn't destroy the system of control, they renamed it. What was once brutality became benevolence. What was once oppression became order. And what was once obedience became civic virtue. That's how the chain survived, by learning to smile. In the mid-19th century, as the wife auction faded from public squares, a new kind of control emerged, cleaner, quieter, more sophisticated. The same power structures that once sold women now built institutions to protect them. Charities, schools, churches. The same hands that humiliated now claimed to educate. But the intent was the same, to shape the mind before it ever learned to question. It was the dawn of psychological control. The architects of morality became architects of perception. They realized the public no longer needed to be chained, it only needed to be guided. So, the language of command changed. You must obey became, you must believe. You are property became, you are a citizen. And the result was the same. Allegiance without awareness. The press, newly powerful, became their perfect tool. Newspapers printed moral stories, not to inform, but to instruct. Every tale of scandal and redemption reinforced the same message. Deviance brings ruin, compliance brings safety. And people absorbed it willingly, because it arrived wrapped in progress. Governments learned the trick too. They found that fear of chaos was stronger than any whip. Obey, they whispered, or everything will fall apart. And the people obeyed, not from terror, but from loyalty. That's the rebranding of chains. When control feels like duty, you stop noticing the cage. Even now, this design remains. Institutions tell you what is good, what is safe, what is moral. And you follow, believing you are choosing. But choice without awareness is just obedience in disguise. The old auction block may be gone, but its spirit lingers in the silent contracts we sign every day, with systems that promise us purpose while quietly selling our freedom. Progress was the costume. Control was the play, and the audience still applauds. Silence in towns like these had a currency of its own. It could buy you a reputation, it could buy you time, and for Eliza Harrow it had bought her survival. But silence, when held too long, begins to rot. Weeks passed after the night of the auction. The whispers didn't fade, they simply learned to walk softer. Men spoke less loudly in taverns when her name was mentioned. Wives crossed themselves when she passed. And though the town appeared to move on, something beneath it was cracking. Eliza no longer smiled when she served tea. The small silver locket around her neck, a trinket her husband had once given her, was now a chain she couldn't unclasp. Inside it was not a picture, but a folded slip of paper burned at one corner. A contract, a promise, a curse. One morning the town magistrate arrived at her home unannounced. His carriage rolled up the hill in silence, drawn by black horses that seemed to know where they were going. He was a pale man, known for enforcing order with the kind of calm that frightened people more than anger ever could. "Eliza Harrow," he said, stepping into her parlor. "You were seen leaving the market the night of your husband's sale. There are questions." Her hand tightened around the teacup. "Questions," she whispered, "or judgments?" The magistrate smiled thinly. "That depends on what you answer." She looked past him toward the window where the townsfolk often gathered to watch, pretending not to. And for the first time, Eliza realized something cruel. Her story was no longer hers. It belonged to the whispers, to the hands that traded gossip like currency, and to the men who had wagered her dignity on a piece of rope and a name shouted in the square. "I have nothing to say," she finally murmured. "Then that," said the magistrate, rising slowly, "is the most expensive answer of all." When he left, she sat alone, the air heavy with what hadn't been said. The walls seemed to breathe around her. The silence she'd bought was no longer protection. It was a sentence. And that night, in the flicker of her candle, Eliza began to write a letter, not of apology, not of confession, but of revelation. Because the truth, once written, no longer belonged to silence. The letter began as a whisper. Eliza's hand trembled over the paper, ink pooling where hesitation lingered. Each word she wrote felt like a small rebellion against the silence that had been stitched into her skin. The house was quiet, save for the tick of the mantel clock and the soft, uneasy hum of the wind pressing against the shutters. She wrote to no one, and yet to everyone. The magistrate, her late husband, the town itself. "You auctioned me once," she began, "but you will not own what I remember." The words spilled faster after that. She described the night of the sale, how the men gathered not just to buy, but to judge, how her husband's voice broke when he spoke her name, not out of love, but fear. how the winning bid wasn't for her hand, but for her silence. In her letter, Eliza named names, men of power, men who had watched the auction not as bystanders, but as architects, and beneath the ink, she wrote a single line that would one day burn through the archives of the town like fire. The one who bid last never left the square alive. When she sealed the letter, she did not send it. She slipped it inside the same locket she had once worn for love. It hung heavy around her neck now, as though aware of its new purpose. Not to remember, but to warn. But fate, in places like Harrow's Crossing, has a way of unsealing what should remain buried. 3 days later, the letter was found, not by her, not by choice, but by a servant girl who dusted the parlor and noticed the locket hanging open on the table. She read it aloud, her voice trembling, the words echoing through the empty house like a confession spoken to ghosts. By evening, the letter had already spread beyond her walls. Copies were whispered into existence, words carried from lips to paper, from paper to fear, and by the time the magistrate returned, Eliza was gone. Her carriage had been full, and by the river, the door open, the seat empty. Only the locket remained, swinging gently from a branch. The letter gone. The town called it madness. The magistrate called it justice. But the women called it something else. They called it a beginning. They gathered first in whispers, behind the baker's shop, under the bell tower, in the shadows where men didn't look twice. The women of Harrow's Crossing, long silenced, began to remember aloud. Eliza's disappearance had carved a wound through the town, but it was not grief that filled it. It was awakening. Her letter, now scattered in fragments, had become scripture in their hands, a truth too dangerous to speak, yet too powerful to forget. Each woman brought a story. One recalled being traded for debt forgiveness. Another remembered the auction that sold her cousin for a bottle of gin and a field. The younger ones listened, their faces pale, their breath unsteady, realizing that their mother's laughter had been armor, not joy. They spoke in candlelight, voices trembling but unbroken. "They call it custom," one said. "We call it theft." The oldest among them, a woman named Mercy, raised her hand for silence. She had been sold twice, once as a wife, once as a widow. Her eyes glimmered like glass under flame. "A law written by men is not the same as a law written by God," she said softly, "and yet they worship the one that profits them most." That night they swore an oath, no parchment, no ink, just the press of fingers and the whisper of breath. They vowed to carry the truth until the town could no longer deny it. But oaths, especially those spoken in secret, have a way of summoning what listens. Because in the weeks that followed, strange things began to happen. The auctioneer's barn caught fire, not from lightning, but from something deliberate. The magistrate's wife vanished, leaving behind a single charred letter folded into her Bible. And on the wall of the town square, someone painted words in ash and tallow. She was never property. The men called it witchcraft. The women called it remembrance, and as the wind swept through the square, Carwine, rieing the scent of smoke and rain, something ancient stirred, something older than the market, older than law itself. "A reckoning," whispered one of the widows as she watched the flames dance in the night. "Not revenge," she said, "recognition." Because once women begin to remember, history itself begins to tremble. It began as a single flicker, a light that should have died quickly in the rain. But it didn't. The fire rose from the auction yard as though called by name, licking the night sky with a hunger that felt almost human. By morning, there was nothing left but blackened timber and molten brass. The auction bell, half buried in ash, still warm to the touch. They said lightning struck. They said the storm had turned wild. But those who stood close enough swore they heard something inside the fire, something speaking. The blacksmith who had once forged the chains for the auction post claimed he heard a voice call his name. A woman's voice, soft yet unyielding, whispering words that were not words at all. He fell to his knees, weeping, muttering, "She remembers me." The next day he was gone. His forge stood cold, and on the anvil someone had carved a single word into the iron: debt. No one could explain it, no one wanted to, but men who had once profited from the trade began to vanish, one by one. Some fled the town. Others were found wandering the fields, whispering apologies to the air, as if speaking to ghosts only they could see. And then came the dream. Across Harrow's Crossing, wives, widows, and daughters woke with the same vision: a woman standing in the ashes of the auction yard, her dress smoldering, her eyes alight with something beyond this world. She carried no weapon, no threat, only a mirror, cracked down the center, which she lifted to every dreamer's face. Those who dared to look swore they saw not themselves, but her, Eliza, or something wearing her memory. The town began to tremble under its own history. The mayor ordered the ruins cleared, the church held prayers for deliverance, but the wind carried whispers through every sermon, drowning the words of men with something older, truer, and merciless. The women didn't fear it, they called eyes. The fire that spoke, the reckoning of every woman who had been priced, weighed, and sold. And somewhere, under the ruins, the soil began to breathe, as if remembering the footsteps of those who had been led to auction and never truly left. When the townsmen rebuilt the auction house, they thought they were burying the past. But the past does not stay buried. It waits. It listens. It learns to speak through what's left behind. It was during that rebuilding, weeks after the fire, that a boy found it. A small, round mirror hidden beneath the charred floorboards of the old stage. The glass was cracked down the middle, the handle warped by heat. Yet when he lifted it to his face, he swore he saw someone standing behind him, a woman. She was not there when he turned, but her reflection remained, staring back, unblinking, patient, alive. He dropped the mirror and ran. The next morning, the mirror was gone. No one spoke of it, but whispers returned. The new auctioneer, a man brought in from another county, began to dream of women standing in rows of smoke, each holding that same mirror. He said they watched him, waiting for him to remember something he never lived. By the third night, he smashed every mirror in his home. Still, his reflection kept watching. Word spread quickly, not just of hauntings, but of reflections that moved differently than those who cast them. The preacher declared it blasphemy, that the devil was at work among them. Yet even he began to stumble over his sermons, his own reflection mouthing words his lips did not form. It was Mercy, the old widow, who said what no one else dared to. "The mirror isn't cursed," she said. "It's honest." She claimed it had been made for the wives, not the buyers, forged by a blacksmith's widow who refused to let her husband's tools be used for chains. The mirror, she said, was meant to show truth where law refused to. And when the fire consumed the auction house, that truth broke loose. Now it searched for those who had forgotten. It didn't haunt the guilty. It awakened the blind. Because every reflection is a confession waiting to be read. And in Harrow's Crossing, the glass had started remembering everything it had ever seen. The women knew, the men feared. And beneath the new floorboards, something gleamed in the dark, waiting for the next one to look too long. By winter, every mirror in Harrow's Crossing had vanished. Some were smashed in fear, others quietly removed, buried in fields, tossed into the river under moonlight. The glass merchants stopped coming. Even puddles were avoided. Windows grew heavy with grime. Curtains never opened. The townspeople said it was superstition, that reflections had become portals for madness. But the truth was simpler and far more terrifying. They were afraid of what the mirrors were starting to show. It began subtly. Faces didn't age the same way inside the glass. Eyes flickered with unfamiliar guilt. And sometimes, when a man stood before his own reflection, the woman he'd once wronged appeared beside him. Silent, still, her gaze unrelenting. One man, a former magistrate, claimed the reflection spoke his name in a voice he had heard 20 years before, the night he'd overseen an auction of a woman called Eliza Ward. He didn't sleep after that. By the next morning, his housekeeper found him sitting before a broken mirror, whispering, She forgave me too late. After that, the church ordered a cleansing ritual, a declaration that the devil had taken root in idle vanity. The sermon echoed through the cold stone walls, but outside no one could ignore the sound of the river, how it gurgled like breath beneath ice, as if something alive waited beneath. Because though the people had rid themselves of mirrors, the reflections did not die. They moved elsewhere, to the glass of windows, the surfaces of knives, the shimmer of frozen ponds. Women said they saw figures behind them while washing clothes, shapes in the sheen of pewter cups. And one night, when a storm shattered the church's stained glass window, the villagers found something strange beneath the shards. Faint outlines of faces burned into the color itself, like memory etched by lightning. The preacher fled the next day. The town was left in silence. No reflections, no sermons, no explanations, only a growing awareness that the line between the living and the remembered had been erased. For the first time in generations, Harrow's Crossing no longer looked at itself. And that, Mercy said, was how corruption begins. Not in sin, but in forgetting to face what we've done. It came without warning, a rain that felt too heavy, too deliberate, like the sky was emptying something it had held too long. By dusk the river had swollen past its banks, and the people of Harrow's Crossing could hear it breathing. Yes, breathing. Slow, deliberate, almost human. The water crawled up the streets, dark as oil, pulling with it what the town had buried. First came the bones of cattle, then the rusted hinges of old wagons. But when the moon broke through the clouds, people began to see shapes in the current, figures drifting just beneath the surface, their outlines faint but unmistakable. Women in torn dresses, bare feet, rope marks around wrists, Eliza among them. Her eyes were open, but they did not accuse, they invited. Those who saw her swore she was mouthing something, not words but rhythm, like the sound of a chant carried through water. A hymn of the forgotten. By midnight, the church bell began to ring, though no one was there to pull the rope. The sound echoed through the flooded streets, each toll slower than the last, until it no longer sounded like metal, but like breathing, the kind that comes between sobs. Mercy stood at her window, watching the river rise. She whispered to the younger women who had gathered in her home. "It's not a flood, it's a memory returning home." The men tried to build barricades, but the water ignored them. It rose calmly, deliberately, curling around each house as though seeking entry. And when it touched the auction yard, the water turned still, perfectly still, like glass. Those who dared to look into that stillness saw faces, not strangers, but their own. Not how they looked now, but who they had been when the buying and selling began. Some fell to their knees, begging for forgiveness. Others ran. But there was nowhere left to run. The river had come to reclaim what law had taken, to wash the ledger clean. And by dawn, when the rain stopped, Harrow's Crossing no longer had a river at all, only a long, shallow basin of blackened soil, rippled like skin after a wound has healed. The town believed the storm had passed, but the women knew better. The river hadn't left. It had settled beneath them. Waiting. When the water finally drained away, the town thought it could breathe again. The sun rose clear for the first time in weeks, and men walked the muddy streets, pretending not to notice how the ground felt soft, too soft, beneath their boots. But by nightfall, they realized the flood had not erased their sins, it had preserved them. Children were the first to notice. Playing near the riverbed, they found strange shapes pressed into the soil, impressions of hands, faces, even strands of hair hardened like roots. The prints weren't shallow, they went deep, as if the earth itself had swallowed the memories whole. Then the voices began. At first, faint, a murmur when wind swept through the old auction square, but soon, clearer. Women's voices layered upon one another, whispering from beneath the ground. They didn't beg. They reminded. One farmer claimed that when he dug his spade into the soil, it hit something that sighed. Another swore the mud bled, not red, but black, like ink from a well, too old to dry. Mercy gathered the women again. They met by candlelight, the air thick with the scent of rain and fear. "The soil is speaking," she said. "It wants to be remembered." That night they performed no ritual, no prayer, only silence. They stood barefoot in the mud, eyes closed, letting the damp earth pull against their souls. For the first time they didn't hide from what lay beneath. They listened, and the ground answered, not in words, but in warmth, a pulse, like the beating of a collective heart that had been buried too long. The women wept, not from terror, but from recognition. They understood what the men could not. This was not vengeance. It was memory reclaiming its body. By dawn, something extraordinary happened. Where they had stood, small white flowers began to bloom, not scattered but in lines, rows, as if marking names no one had written into Town's ledgers. The men refused to walk that field again. They called it cursed, but the women called it truth made visible, because soil never forgets who has walked upon it. And when corruption runs deep enough, even the earth learns how to speak. It was the smell that gave it away. A strange mix of rot and ink drifting up through the floorboards of the old stone church. The priest had fled weeks ago, leaving the door unbarred, the altar untouched. But when the women finally entered, guided by the scent and by something older than courage, they found the stairs, hidden behind the pulpit, sealed with wax and scripture. Mercy pressed her hand against the seal. It crumbled like ash. The air grew colder as they descended, lanterns trembling in their hands. The walls were lined with ledgers, hundreds of them, bound in leather, their spines cracked with age. Each one carried a year, neatly inscribed in gold. 1802, 1803, 1804. The town's entire history, buried beneath the very building that claimed to offer salvation. When they opened the first ledger, they found what no one was meant to see. Lists of women, names written beside prices. Next to each, the initials of the man who had purchased her, sometimes followed by a single word: deceased, returned, dissolved. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was steady, meticulous, almost reverent. These weren't just records, they were confessions disguised as order. Mercy turned the pages slowly, her breath shallow. Then she stopped at a name written in thicker ink as though the writer had pressed harder. Eliza Ward. Next to it, sold, escaped, reclaimed. Reclaimed? One woman whispered. But Mercy didn't answer. Her fingers traced the word like a wound reopening. She turned the page, and there, between sheets of parchment, lay something that didn't belong. A piece of scorched paper. It was from Eliza's letter. "The price of silence is the soul of the town." The words were faint, half-burned, but enough to chill every voice in that room, because now they understood. The church hadn't just hidden the records, it had protected them, preserving the system, beneath a mask of holiness. And when the women closed the ledger, the candles flickered. The ground beneath the pews shifted, a slow groan echoing through the stone. One of them whispered, "It knows we've seen it." And for the first time, the sound that rose from below wasn't the whisper of wind or memory. It was breathing. Something alive in the archives, stirring from a century of silence. It began as a low hum, almost human, almost mechanical. The women froze, lanterns shaking, their light throwing wild shapes across the stone. Beneath the pulpit, the floor seemed to rise and fall in rhythm with something alive. Each breath was slow, deep, measured, like something enormous was sleeping just beneath them. Mercy knelt, her knees pressing into cold stone. "It's not a spirit," she whispered. "It's memory." The others didn't understand. Memory shouldn't breathe. Memory shouldn't sound like lungs filling with grief. But when Mercy pressed her ear to the ground, she heard words in the rhythm, faint, layered, echoing through time. "Do not sell what you cannot own. Do not name what was never yours." The sound rolled through the church, vibrating the pews, rattling the stained glass. Dust fell from the rafters like snow. The ledgers quivered on their shelves, their pages fluttering as though something beneath them exhaled. Then, silence. For a moment, no one moved. The lantern light flickered weakly against the altar, where the wood began to split. A crack, fine as a hairline fracture, ran down the center of the pulpit, widening with a groan. From within it rose a smell, damp, metallic, unmistakably human. And then came the sound of paper tearing. The ledgers began to unravel. Pages flew into the air like frightened birds, spinning, colliding, bursting into flame without heat. Words burned but did not vanish. They imprinted themselves on the walls in black script, names. Hundreds of them. Women once reduced to ink and price, now written across sacred stone. One of the younger women fell to her knees weeping. "They're trying to come back," she said. Mercy shook her head. "No, they never left." The breathing deepened again, now joined by something new, the steady rhythm of footsteps far below, as if someone walked a circular path beneath the church. And then a voice, low, feminine, unmistakably clear, rose from the crack beneath the pulpit. "If they built their faith upon our silence, then let their silence become our sermon." Every candle extinguished at once. The church plunged into darkness, save for one faint glowing line tracing across the floor, leading toward the cemetery behind the chapel. Mercy lifted her lantern's empty frame and whispered, "It's time to dig where faith was buried." And together, the women followed the light. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the soil behind the chapel was still breathing, slow and rhythmic, like something alive beneath it was counting their steps. The women followed the faint glowing line that led from the pulpit to the cemetery, where rows of crooked stones leaned like guilty witnesses. They stopped before the oldest grave, the one with no name, only a number. Lot 1. Mercy brushed her fingers across the stone. "This is where it began," she whispered. "The first auctioned wife." The others stared at her. "How do you know?" "Because the earth told me," she said, her eyes glassy in the moonlight. They began to dig, not with tools, but with their hands. Each handful of soil, cold, damp, and strangely fragrant, like iron and ash. The deeper they went, the warmer it became, until one of them gasped and withdrew her hand, her fingertips blackened, not from dirt, but from ink. And then they saw it, parchment. Dozens of sheets pressed together, bound by roots and blood, pages from the ledgers but older, written in a hand none of them recognized, names, dates, prices. But beside each name a strange mark, a circle with a vertical line through it. Mercy lifted one of the pages to the moonlight. The ink shimmered like oil. "It's not a list," she said. "It's a covenant." Before anyone could speak, the ground trembled, the grave shuddered, collapsing inward as if something below had awakened. A hollow gasp rose from the pit, followed by a voice that sounded like it came from every direction at once. "You counted our bodies, not our souls." The air thickened, humming with pressure. The parchment in Mercy's hands burst into flame, but the fire burned cold. Every woman stepped back, shielding their faces as the grave filled with light. Not golden, not red, but a deep, unearthly white, like bone remembering its own shape. Then, silence. When the lies gat faded, the grave had changed. The earth was smooth again, untouched, but the nameless stone was no longer blank. Etched into it, freshly cut, were the words, "Eliza Ward, sold, escaped, returned." Mercy fell to her knees. The others watched as the ink from their hands seeped into the soil, like blood finding its way home. And from the distance the church bell began to ring again, slowly, deliberately, though no one was there to pull the rope. The women did not run. They listened, because this time the ringing wasn't a warning. It was a summons. The night was windless, but the trees outside the barrow house were moving, swaying as if something unseen passed between them. The lantern by the porch door flickered 3 times and then went out completely. When the sheriff entered the house, the first thing he noticed wasn't the smell of death. It was the silence. the kind that didn't just fill a room but pressed against it. He found Mrs. Barrow sitting upright in her chair, her eyes wide, mouth frozen mid-scream. There were no wounds on her body, no blood, no signs of struggle, only a strange circular burn on her chest, the size of a coin, and the faint smell of sulphur in the air. The old man, however, was nowhere to be found. Only his boots remained by the door. The sheriff called for his deputy, but before the man could answer, a voice came from the upstairs hall, low, whispering, and identical to the sheriff's own. "Leave," it said, "before it takes your name." He froze. The whisper came again, closer this time, like it was crawling along the walls. By dawn, the Barrow house was empty once more. The sheriff's horse was found tied to the fence, but the man himself was gone. The only thing left behind was his badge, still warm, lying in the exact spot where Mrs. Barrow had died. Locals would later claim they saw something wandering the property for weeks after. Something that looked like the sheriff, spoke like him, but never came close enough to touch. And when they did finally approach, its skin began to ripple, like something beneath it was trying to crawl out. They say it smiled, not with lips, but with skin. And that was when they realized, whatever had come out of that hole the old man dug wasn't gone. It had simply learned how to wear a human face. Weeks passed. The townspeople buried Mrs. Barrow on the hill behind the church, though no priest agreed to perform the rites. They whispered that the soil beneath her coffin moved, even after the grave was filled. Life in Millfield slowed, but never healed. The children stopped playing near the old Barrow farm. The pastor boarded his windows and left town without a word. By winter, half the village was gone. The other half avoided speaking of what they'd seen. Shadows that moved against the direction of light, and voices that called them by name when no one was around. Then one night, just before the first snow, a knock came at the sheriff's office. Deputy Miller, the only lawman left, opened the door. A tall man stood in the dark, hat pulled low. "Miller," he said in a voice the deputy recognized. "It's me." The light hit his face, and Miller dropped his lantern. It was the sheriff, the same eyes, the same badge on his chest, but his skin was pale, stretched too tight, like wet parchment over bone. His mouth didn't move when he spoke. "I went down there," it said, "and it followed me back." Miller stammered, reaching for his gun, but the figure only tilted its head, eyes wide and wet. "Don't make it angry," it whispered. "It remembers you." Then, before the deputy could fire, the figure peeled away, not ran, not vanished, but came apart like dust caught in a breeze. All that remained was a faint smell of iron and soil. The next morning, every mirror in town was found cracked from the inside. And though no one saw the hollow man again, children said that if you stood by the Barrow field after sunset, you could still hear a shovel, digging somewhere deep below, digging not for gold, but for names. They thought it ended there, with graves filled, with names forgotten, with silence heavy enough to smother the truth. But the earth doesn't forget. The ground beneath Millfield still hums at night, a low, steady tremor, like breath under the soil. Decades passed. The roads changed. The church burned. The Barrow land was fenced off and sold to a company that promised progress. But every machine that touched that ground broke within days. Workers complained of whispers inside their helmets, of voices murmuring beneath the hum of engines. One man swore he saw fingers, thin, bone-white, pressing upward from the dirt, reaching for his boots. The town historian later found a box sealed behind the old courthouse wall, filled with names, dates, and strange charcoal drawings of a man with no eyes and a shovel in his hands. Written across every page were the same 3 words, scrawled in different ink, different handwriting. "He still digs." And maybe that's the point they missed. The hollow man was never a ghost, never a single face or story. He was something older, a punishment, a memory, a mirror held up to the kind of men who thought women could be sold like cattle, who thought suffering could be owned. He was the price of silence, the echo of every soul buried under the weight of cruelty disguised as custom. So when you feel the soil shift beneath your feet, when the wind carries a whisper that knows your name, remember what history tried to hide. Some sins don't die. They wait. And if you listen closely right now, wherever you are, you might hear it too. That slow, steady rhythm, that breath beneath the world. Shovel, pause, shovel, pause. He doesn't rest anymore, because the earth itself remembers what we tried to erase, and it wants us to remember too. So tell me, did you hear it? Type in the comments, the earth still breathes, once for remembrance, and once to prove you're still alive. Fade out, wind, heartbeat, distant shovel striking earth.